full of myself with an upright bass yet. Come then. All right. Anyways, but that's not why we're here. None of that's why we're here. We're here tonight because we're really lucky to actually have a good guy in the music industry. One of the guys who've been doing it right for a long time. He started as a singer-songwriter in the 70s, and we had a picture for those who came early of his LP release, if you saw that. He's been a producer, a musician, a music supervisor, a manager, entertainment lawyer, etc. So he's sort of like the Swiss Army knife of the music industry. On top of that, he was on the team that got together the Digital Performance Right and Sound Recording Act in 1995, which is the reason anyone with a P copyright makes any money from that, from any sort of performance rights from that. So he's a great guy. He's kind of a big deal. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Simson.
I like the Swiss Army knife.
Put that on the resume.
It's definitely going to be on my resume, Swiss Army knife.
So tell us how you got started. You actually went to law school for criminal law, and somehow with a few pivots ended up, being one of the most well-known performing rights and label advocates in the music industry. What happened? What went right?
Well, law school was kind of a funny thing for me because I was kind of running away from the music industry. I was actually singing 3 nights a week, working my way through law school, playing in clubs. And, I can't remember how many Eagles and, Beatles songs I sang during the course of that time. But, just playing in smoky bars, making some money while I was going to law school. But I had dropped out of Cornell as an undergrad to sign a record deal. 1970, I signed a deal. I was a kid, got shipped to London to record, and put out the one piece of vinyl in 1971, and opened for Jethro Tull on the Aqualung tour, and had some interesting experiences touring, playing colleges for a couple, 3 years, and then decided to go to law school to get away from it. I was really trying to get out. And after law school, I was going to do criminal defense. I really wanted to represent criminals. And then
so
I realized
the industry is not that different from you sort of.
It's just a different outlet for the creativity. Yeah. But I started to realize that I didn't really like these people that I was defending. So it didn't last long. And then all of a sudden, the musicians that I had worked with during my career started calling me up, saying, "Can you help me?" And I knew the business, having worked in it, but I really, had to school myself in the law. And I went through 2 or 3 years of just incredible learning how the legal side of the business worked. And then I had a client who came into the office, fascinating story that maybe one day I'll write. He was an African-American guy who sounded like Stevie Wonder singing lead for Led Zeppelin. And he played all the instruments himself. I got him a deal at Elektra in like 6 weeks. No one was getting signed. And he was brilliant. He had been on tour with Parliament Funkadelic as a teenager and a bunch of other bands, but he wanted to be Jimi Hendrix, well, Jimmy Page. And rock radio wouldn't play him because he was black. It was very racist in the 1980s on radio. The only person who could get played was Jimi Hendrix because he was dead. He wasn't threatening. It was a very interesting lesson for me. So I got him his deal. He asked me to manage him. I did. It was the first time I ever managed an act. And it was a very frustrating experience. So I left management, back to the law practice, then got a job at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, actually doing public television deals for about a year. And then someone asked me if I wanted to go into business managing an act unknown from DC named Mary Chapin Carpenter. And I said, sure, why not? And I was actually practicing law part-time, supporting her original manager. We became partners, and 10 years later we had 10 million CD sales and 5 Grammys. So that was a great sort of entree into the business. And while I was managing Mary Chapin, I got asked to join the campaign to get a performance right in 1993, 94. We finally got that passed in 95. I never thought when I was lobbying that I would ever, fast forward, end up helping launch Sound Exchange, 5 years later. It was really more me. I thought I'd be managing acts for the rest of my career, or working on my second album. It's only been 40 years since the first one, so, you know, I'm figuring one every 40 years I might get another one out.
Right for the sequel. Before we go any further, I want to say that, forgot to mention, we have Rosabelle up here taking any questions you have via Twitter, and we'll be periodically checking with her to answer those. So feel free to use that. All right, so the first thing, let's just sort of, just for people who are playing at home here, let's sort of clarify who and how did folks get paid in just when there was just terrestrial radio, before the internet, when there was just regular radio, who got paid and who didn't get paid?
Well, as you may know from the beginning of time, in 1909, let's do a little history. Back when I was a boy, 1909, John Philip Sousa, you know, who was the March King, who wrote, you know, Stars and Stripes Forever and all those great marches, the Washington Post March. He and Stephen Foster's heirs went to Congress. Stephen Foster, who wrote The Old Folks at Home and Swanee River and all those great songs, he died penniless, even though his songs were being played everywhere, every day. They went to Congress and said, when songwriters' songs get played in public, they need to get paid. And so in 1909, Congress adopted a performance right for songwriters. Now think about it. At that point, who was going to object? 1909. It was before radio. There really wasn't anything organized at that point. Even motion pictures, nothing was organized. So the songwriters got their rights. 1909. It's not a surprise that in 1914, ASCAP gets formed. ASCAP gets formed by the writers and the composers and the publishers to go out and collect money. First it was 10 cents a seat in every movie theater. When radio started in the 1920s, ASCAP was going in to get money from radio stations when they started running ads and making money. Now, back in the 1920s, radio stations didn't want to pay, so they formed the National Association of Broadcasters. They went to Congress. They tried to get ASCAP shut down as a monopoly. They actually got the head of ASCAP jailed in the 1930s for trying to collect money from a station in Arizona. Another long story for another day. But you know, the broadcasters really went after ASCAP in a big way. Ultimately, the broadcasters basically gave in, started paying, and then in 1940, they actually created BMI to compete with ASCAP to try to bring the prices down, but that's another story for another time as well. But performers, where were they? In 1909, there really was no recording industry. So Congress added this right for songwriters. You know, there were some Edison cylinders, but it was pretty much a novelty. So there was no performance right in the sound recording. In fact, there was no copyright in a sound recording in the United States until 1972, 3 months after my album came out. So my album is not protected under copyright. So I will not get my rights back under the termination battle that's coming in 2013. I've asked Universal for my rights back, but you know, it's a negotiation. So, because it's such a valuable record. Go figure.
The plebeians are dying for it again.
Exactly. In fact, I sometimes find it on eBay, because I was on a label that's kind of collectible right now. It's an independent label that got bought by a major. But, and it'll be $35, $40 on eBay, and I'll send a little note to the seller going, this is worth $1. I should know. You know. But in any event, you know, so if you go back to 1909, songwriters got protected. Performers didn't. In the 1920s, radio starts in a big way. And the advertising campaign that radio used is really interesting. A person could buy the Victrola, and then you'd have to buy a lot of records to listen to music in your house, or you could buy radio. And they would say, imagine how many records you'd have to buy to hear all the music you can hear for free if you have a radio. I mean, so we had a battle of technology in the 1920s between the Victrola and the radio. Radio back then was called wireless because it came into your home without wires. It was a magical thing. We don't think of radio as wireless anymore, do we? But in any event, so that's what happened. And in the 1920s, performers were actually getting paid to play on the radio. Big bands would come in on Sunday night and play a special show sponsored by Maytag or RCA or any of the big sponsors of the day, and they get paid pretty well. All of a sudden, radio realized we don't have to pay these people. We'll just play the records and pretend they're here. You know, the fans don't really care anymore. Radio, the big band leaders were really unhappy. Big band leaders in the 1930s did not want to be played on the radio. They didn't want radio play. Imagine that. You say, well, it's promotional. No, we don't want it. We think if you play it on the radio, people won't have to come out and see us where we're playing. People won't have to come see us because they can hear it for free on the radio. Two big band leaders, Paul Whiteman and Fred Waring, actually put on their records, not authorized for radio play. RCA went along with it, put it on the label. Radio stations played it anyway, and these two band leaders sued them. They both won in the lower court, Paul Whiteman in the state of New York, Fred Waring in the state of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, Paul Whiteman lost on appeal. There was no copyright protection in the United States for sound recordings at that point. And they said the radio stations are free to play it. You had no right to control the playing of your record. Pennsylvania courts came down completely differently, and Fred Waring actually won. So if you're in Pennsylvania and you're a recording artist, you can actually stop radio from playing your record. At least that's what the case from the 1930s would say. When this came down, recording artists came together and said, we need to get paid when our songs are being used by radio. A campaign was started in the 30s. It was unsuccessful. The war came in the 1940s and people kind of lost track. In the 50s, Sinatra started the campaign again, to no avail. In the 60s, another campaign, no avail. In the 70s, a little bit of movement. We finally got a copyright in the sound recording February 15th of 1972. And there was a deal struck, though. The record industry wanted the copyright also because bootlegging was becoming more and more prevalent. People were now manufacturing vinyl and cassettes of people's recordings and selling them. And while the record companies were using common law and state law, they wanted copyright law protection to get bigger damages. The radio station said, okay, we'll give you the copyright so you can protect from piracy, but you don't get a performance right as part of it. So a deal was struck in '72. Now, the record industry came back to Congress in '76 and said, we really should have this performance right. They have it in just about every other modern country in the world at that point. Congress said, let's have a study. Library of Congress did a study. The Register of Copyrights came out with a report in '78 called the Ringer Report. It said U.S. performers should have a performance right when radio uses their works.
And that was 78.
1978. So broadcasters said, we don't want to pay. Anybody know why the broadcasters are probably the strongest lobby in Congress?
Most money?
Not the most money.
Ah, okay.
Other people have more money. Oil has more money. Pharmaceuticals have more money. Yeah. Every congressman needs to get on the radio and TV to get elected. Exactly. So there's a radio station and a TV station in every congressional district. You need to be on there if you're going to win your election. So the broadcasters own Congress. It's very hard to get something passed. So now imagine the record industry, you know, 1988, Sinatra sends out letters to his 30 closest friends. The Beatles, Prince, Michael Jackson. It was a very odd assemblage, but he sent out letters to the 30 biggest stars of the day saying, we need to get together, form an organization, and get these rights that exist in Europe that don't exist here in the United States. Now you should understand that in Europe, recording artists have the right to get paid when their songs are played on radio, in doctors' offices, anywhere. In restaurants, if your work is being played, you're getting paid. I would venture to guess that since the 1980s, American artists have been losing about $100 million a year. So for the last 30 years, that's $3 billion. And that, I think, is probably understating the problem. That's how much money we've lost from our economy, from our artists. In France, they take the money that American artists would earn and they put it to French music education and French cultural programs. So we're supporting, our artists are supporting French music education and French symphonies and French.
You mean freedom music education?
Yeah, freedom music,
okay.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember those days. I'm a big Freedom Fry guy. But anyway, so Sinatra started the campaign, nothing happened. I got approached by the recording industry in 1993, a new campaign to get a full performance right. But there was a new element to this performance rights campaign. Coming down the road was this new digital thing. And if we weren't careful, this new digital thing would change the world as we knew it. And it was very interesting. I mean, a lot of people accuse the record companies of being dinosaurs. No, they didn't expect Napster to come. But they did see digital coming and really campaigned hard in Congress to get a digital performance right, it was really supposed to be a full performance right. What they realized was the broadcasters, who completely have the power to shut things down, all of a sudden were an ally. Hey, wait a minute, the broadcaster said, if we help the record industry make all the digital services pay and we don't have to pay, our future competitors will have a cost that we won't have. And I'm sure that this was what was going on in the broadcaster's mind. They've never said it, but the broadcasters allowed the music industry to get a performance right, but limited to digital, satellite, and cable.
And here we're talking about the 1995 digital.
Correct. There were actually only 3 companies that existed in 1995 that were subject to this law: DMX, Music Choice, and Muzak. And what they were doing at that time was, if any of you had DirecTV or DishNet or whatever the early stages of satellite television were, those were the blue screen music channels up on the dial that you could tune into and you could hear music. So those 3 services supplied music over satellite. So they got grandfathered, those 3 services. They had to pay something, but it ended up being about half of what everyone else pays. And again, that's a very small business. It's still, to this day, about $3 million a year, the blue screen channels that you get on your digital cable or DirecTV, DishNet. You have MTV Urge got into the business for a while, XM and Sirius got into that business for a while, but it's tiny. Typically, 27 cents a month per subscriber gets paid to the people who run those channels, and then obviously the music industry gets a small percentage of that, about 7.5%. So it's been a very small fee. But back in 1995, satellite radio was coming, but they were getting ready to launch their satellites. No one really knew what was going on there with XM and Sirius at the time, but we knew it was coming. The more interesting piece of that was this notion that online or on the internet there was unlimited bandwidth, unlike the radio, where you could essentially create a site and have an all Springsteen channel, an all Madonna channel, an all Beatles channel. You could basically, every artist you wanted, you could just play their music nonstop. And why would a consumer ever have to go out and buy a piece of product if you could just tune into that channel anytime you wanted? So that was one of the big key issues in that 1995 Act. So you will see there's a programming restriction online. If you have a station, you can only play 4 songs by a particular artist in any 3-hour period. And that's really what this was about. Of course, no one knew we were going to get LimeWire and Grokster and all the other stirs at that time. So this was one approach to try to prevent that with the unlimited online capacity. There was a little bit of I would say, confusion whether the 1995 Act applied to webcasting. And so in 1998, the DMCA made clear that even if you weren't subscription, if you weren't charging a fee to your consumers, if you were ad-supported, for example, you would still be covered under the statute.
And that's what knocked out simulcast, the practice of terrestrial radios simultaneously webcasting their shows.
Well, no, what happened, that was interesting too. So the broadcasters, as I mentioned, I think allowed this to happen thinking that they weren't going to have to pay and these new services would have to pay. There's some language in that law, in the 1995 and 1998 laws, that say that if you're streaming within 75 miles of your tower, then you don't have to pay. So the broadcasters were thinking, okay, we're not going to have to pay anything even when we stream, even though it looks exactly the same. They also grandfathered HD radio. HD radio, which looks nothing different than any webcasting or satellite radio, is grandfathered. They don't have to pay for their HD radio signals unless they charge a fee. As long as it's free to the consumer, they don't have to pay for it. But what happened was they didn't realize that the technology involved in streaming from their towers always takes it more than 150 miles. It's just the way the internet works. And so they lost a court battle. They said, we don't have to pay when we stream. And the copyright office said, no, you do have to pay when you stream. And there was a lawsuit in 2003, Bonneville versus Peters, and they lost. And since the 2003 decision, they've paid retroactively back to 1998 when the law first started to apply. So broadcasters pay when they stream online. The one difference with broadcasters is because over the air they don't have play restrictions, You're also not going to have an all-artist channel over the air. They can't afford to have them. They'll alienate too many over-the-air listeners. They tried an all-Elvis channel at one point in terrestrial radio. Lasted about 3 months. But there's an all-Elvis channel on Sirius. Again, satellite radio where you pay, and they have so many more channels you can afford to have an all-artist channel.
Right.
So that's kind of how we got here. But for years, it was only the songwriters who got paid from airplay. Performers never got paid.
And that's we're talking about the C copyright and the P copyright.
Correct. So the composition, the person who wrote the song, that's why in bands, the people who wrote the music got rich off of hit singles, where you could earn $250,000, $300,000 from a good hit record.
Take note, all drummers and bass players.
It's true. I used to call the performance right and sound recordings the drummer and bass player, law, but I was actually a bass player, but I was a songwriter. But it's at least a start where the performers are now getting paid as well as the composers. This year, Sound Exchange will probably collect over $350 million. My first year at Sound Exchange, we collected $3 million. So it's grown in 10 years.
Right.
Quite substantially. I think, from an equity standpoint, there's really nothing that the radio stations can say that supports their argument that they shouldn't have to pay. For years it was, well, we promote. And my argument was always, well, that's irrelevant. You're making money using this music. So it's almost like saying, okay, I'm going to promote your career by using your songs. You have no say in the matter. You don't have the right to say no. So if you're an artist and you own your own recording, you can't say no to radio. They can play it if they want to. They can overplay it, as we know they often do. When they have a massive hit, they play it so much that you never want to hear it again. And they burn records. I mean, that's something that they do. But you don't have the right to say no. I mean, when you create something, shouldn't you have the right to control it and the right to say no? There is no other business that I know of where someone gets to use your stuff because it's good for you. And you have no say in the matter. So, I always said to radio, and this was something I learned when I was managing acts, we always wanted to have a hit on the radio, don't get me wrong. But what we knew about the radio was this. About 10% of the people who listen to the radio are active listeners. People who go out and enter the contest, people who go buy concert tickets, people who go buy the CDs. 90% are passive. They use it as their form of entertainment. If you ask them why they don't buy more CDs, and they might buy 1 or 2 a year, they'll say, I hear enough music on the radio. Not everybody is the 5 or 10% like you guys. I mean, you've probably figured that out, right? You're out there trying everything, Spotify and whatever is new, Tumblr, a turntable FM, whatever you hear about, you're out there trying to figure it out, and what's a great new way to discover great new music. You're not the 90%. I mean, it's why Pandora now has generic stations where people don't have to do as much work. It's a lot of work to say, I like this artist, and I like this artist, I like this, I don't like this. For most people, I want to turn it on and have it play me things I want to hear. And that's why 237 million Americans still tune into Clear Channel every week. I mean, that's the reality. So, think of it this way. Radio in the early days, imagine how many records you'd have to buy to get all the music you can hear here for free. Now imagine you're driving in your car. You don't have an iPod. It's pre-iPod. Okay?
Stay with us.
Stay with me here. There is no radio. They're not allowed to play music because artists don't want them to. So you can get the traffic, you can get the weather. If you want to listen to music, where's that music coming from? Music you own and purchase, right? Or friend burned for you. It's okay. So if you think about it, radio in the car is very substitutional. You'd be using your own music, even your own iPod, obviously, if you weren't listening into the radio. I always said to radio, look, I'll give you credit for the 10% of the people who buy stuff. Just pay me for the 90% who never buy anything. And that's what I always felt was fair. If you look at every other modern country around the globe, they all have a performance right. All the performers get paid, all throughout Europe, Asia. It's always a great line. The only countries that the United States joins by not paying performers is Iraq, Iran, North Korea.
Oh.
Yeah, the axis of evil. So, so that, I mean, that's just the way it works, and it's clearly the lobbying power of the NAB.
Did we have any questions? Did anyone tweet for us here, Rosabelle?
Yeah, we have a couple tweets. So, one person asked, so far, what has been the hardest part of your career? Like, what was the low for you, and then how did you overcome that?
That's a really good question. I remember, you know, obviously I got signed at a really young age. That was my goal, to get a record deal. I got the record deal. I got sent to London. I recorded with idols of mine. It was pretty remarkable. But then my record didn't do that well. Got some airplay, but you know, the first 5,000 pressed are the only 5,000 that exist as far as I know. And then when I got out of law school and decided to go back into the music side of things, it was really hard to really break into the business in a meaningful way. I really struggled. And I just remember thinking, I'm passionate about the music industry. I know what I'm doing. I know how the industry works. I know good music. Why can't I get a break? And I think a lot of people feel that way. And I've come to realize later on in my life that they make it really hard to break into this business, because if it was easy, everyone would do it because it's so much fun. I mean, that's true. And they really want to make sure that you have that passion, that you have to do this, and that it's inside you. And you know, I think for me that was, you know, I mean, one year I'm managing an unknown act. The next year, you know, we have 4 top 20 singles, and we're going platinum. And all of a sudden, every week after that, I'm getting sent a band by a major label saying, manage this. I mean, what had changed? I now had a hot act, you know. So just to understand that, I remember seeing Sammy Kahn when he was in his 90s, and legendary songwriter. And Sammy Kahn said, you know, if you want to be a successful songwriter, have a really big trunk. And I was like, what? So yeah, to keep all your songs in it, because people will turn you down, and then you're going to have a hit, and then they're going to come to you and ask you for songs, and you go into your trunk. Oh, I have this one and this one. So don't throw them away. Save them. They're valuable. They're really good songs. They just don't know that yet. And so, you know, I think that those kinds of things, just stay at it. You've got to really keep at it. And I also think, you know, networking is so critical in this business, because it is a business of relationships. You know, you meet people, you know, when people get to see your work during an internship, they go, wow, we really need a person to do that here. All of a sudden you have a job.
And that doesn't mean, you know, a lot of people take that as like, oh man, it's not a business of merit, you know, it's a business of...
Oh no, it's definitely a business of merit.
I mean, just because it's built on relationships is not saying that you, I mean, it's not, that's just as much a, that's more of the nature of it, not so much a negative of it, you know? Correct.
No. You have to be really smart. You have to really know what you're doing. I mean, if you know stuff that other people don't know, it's a great way for you to get a job. You know, and I think there's a lot of people right now who are filling niches. I hired a guy at Sound Exchange who had run Kanye West's website. And he came to work for me in new media and outreach. And he's brilliant. I mean, and he really knows social media, and he really knows new media, and things that, frankly, I didn't know. I didn't grow up with it the way he did. And he's brilliant. And you know, I think that's, you're right, merit is really important. I don't mean to undercut that at all. But it takes more than that, you know. Hopefully someone will finally see how good you are at what you do. You got to just keep at it and be completely persistent. Not be a pain in the ass, obviously. There's a fine line. But you know, stay at it. You know, it's a wonderful thing when you finally get that first break.
So you recently stepped down from the executive director of Sound Exchange in June, was it?
No, it was December of last year.
December of last year, okay. And one of the, I had this here, one of the goals that you'd said that Sound Exchange had reached was fair rates for performers. What does that mean to you, and how has that changed? How did that come about?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to understand. When we started Sound Exchange, it was very different than what you see now. Sound Exchange was built inside the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America. The major labels built it. They were the only ones who had the money to build something like that before there was any money. When you think about the early days of Sound Exchange, $1 million would come in it would have cost us $1 million to run the place. So basically all the money would have been absorbed in the costs in those early days. You think about the early days of ASCAP, they collected, I think it was about $600,000 in the first 7 or 8 years. And 1922 or 23, they did their first distribution of about $60,000, like 1/10. So every collecting society, the biggest challenge is how you get it started. So we had the luxury, frankly, of having the major labels build it. However, there were some pitfalls, obviously. The original law said that sound exchange, or collecting, it doesn't say sound exchange in the law, it just says that all of the copyright owners can get together and create one organization that represents everyone. It's essentially an antitrust exemption. Typically, if you represented everyone in a marketplace, your monopoly would run afoul of the law. But we had a government-granted monopoly if everybody wanted to get together. What it said was that 95% of the money that we collected, we would pay to the copyright owner, typically that means a label, who would then allocate 45% to the featured performer. The other 5% would be paid to the session musicians and session vocalists through a union fund. Now, I was very concerned about this because if we paid it to the label, I was worried it would never find its way to the artist. I knew from my days as an ASCAP writer that ASCAP divides the money, pays half to the writer, half to the publisher. The writer's money does not flow through the publisher in an ASCAP situation. I thought this should be the same. We modeled Sound Exchange after ASCAP in building it. It needed to be done in a similar way. So we went to the labels and said we need this to be paid directly to the artists. The labels agreed on an experimental basis in 2001 to do that. So that was job one, getting the artist direct payment. Direct payment then became part of the law in 2003. So it's now in the law that the artists get their share directly from Sound Exchange. It does not go through their record companies. The record company can't recoup that money. And what that means is that the artists love having this revenue stream that's essentially split 50-50 between owners and artists. And the Sound Exchange board has become this very interesting group of artists and owners working together to try to, to work together. There's compromises that have to be made. The indies and the majors don't always see, eye to eye. Obviously, the artists and the labels don't always see eye to eye, whether it's major or indie. So it's a very interesting mix, and it's worked really, really well. It's obvious to me that the majors help the indies get a higher rate under the statutory license because those catalogs that the majors own are very valuable. Any one of us has been in a situation where if a big webcaster came and said, I'll play your stuff but give it to me for free, if you're on your own as an independent label, you're probably going to give it away for free. So this has been a way to make sure that that doesn't happen. That, if they're playing an independent artist versus a major artist in Pandora, why shouldn't you both get paid the same? To me, the only thing that should change the rate that you get paid is how many people are actually listening to that track. If 100 people listen to one track and only one listens to another, it's fair that you get 100 times more than this person. Let the marketplace decide how people get paid. The rate should be the same. Now, I think, in interactive streaming, like Spotify or Rhapsody.
And that's, just to clarify, that's, on demand.
On demand.
Click, song I wanted.
Yeah. Remember, on Pandora, you can put in the name of an artist. You can even put in the name of the song, but you won't get that song right then and there, the one that you want. It's not on demand. And in fact, I will tell you, in the early days of Pandora, there was a lot of argument within the Sound Exchange board about whether or not it was an interactive service. If you look at the definition in the statute, it looks like an interactive service. Fortunately for Pandora, there was a case in New York called Launchcast, and when Launchcast won, Launchcast had been bought by Yahoo. When Yahoo won that lawsuit, all of a sudden it meant that personalized radio fit within the Sound Exchange license, and Pandora was able to take advantage of that. But on-demand services like Spotify, where you hear the song you want when you want it, you can click on a song. It's very different if you think about it. Spotify, how many people know how long it took Spotify to get into the United States?
Oh my goodness.
A long time, right? It was a weekly story, right? 6 more months. It's because Spotify had to get a license from every single copyright owner. If you're going to have an on-demand service, you have to get a license. Imagine how many licenses you'd need to play 3 million, 5 million, 15 million tracks. Pandora had to get one license, Sound Exchange. One payment to Sound Exchange. One set of data to Sound Exchange, and we figure it all out for them. Sometimes the data is not particularly good. We still do that work to try to figure out who to pay. Spotify has to go out to every single copyright owner. The transactional costs are so much greater that it almost makes it impossible to run that kind of a service. So
sorry. Well, that's an interesting thing, because we're all obviously music lovers in this room, and you know, a lot of people, I mean, a lot of us, when we checked out Spotify, it's like, oh man, this is great. This is going to ruin me as an artist. You know, there's just this sort of, it's a great service as a consumer, but we see that going into making these services isn't just about how people want to listen to music. That has to be balanced. I mean, there are statutes that define the cost of doing business like that.
yeah, well, so for Sound Exchange, remember, Sound Exchange doesn't actually issue licenses. Congress passed a license and said anyone who qualifies can play whatever music they want. All they've got to do is pay the rate to Sound Exchange. And it sets up a procedure where if you're a new kind of service, there's a 6-month period where there's a voluntary negotiation. If we reach agreement, great. That becomes the new statutory rate. And it has to be blessed by these 3 copyright royalty judges. But if we don't reach agreement, then we go into a litigation, a very expensive litigation. It costs a lot of money when you're litigating against XM, Sirius, Clear Channel, whoever these powers may be. But you know, so Sound Exchange has that government-mandated license that it administers on behalf of everyone in the United States, and actually around the world as well. And we're under an obligation to basically collect all the money and then try to figure out how to pay it out to the many, many tens of thousands of people. Spotify, it's a negotiated license, obviously, with each individual company. All the terms will not be the same. You will not see independent labels getting paid what the majors are getting paid on a stream at Spotify. You know, there's some, I don't know for myself with personal information, but I've heard that the major labels have gotten equity interests in Spotify in exchange for doing the licenses. Wouldn't surprise me, but don't know that it's the case. Is Spotify good for artists? It might be good for educational purposes. I want to hear what this artist sounds like. A friend of mine told me about him. I can go listen to the exact track they wanted me to listen to. Does it mean I'm less likely to buy something? Probably. I mean, think about it. If you really want to hear a specific track and you can go to Spotify and hear it, you won't download it. You don't have to. If you go to Pandora, you don't know if you're going to hear that track that you really want to hear. So there's a big difference there. I was on a radio show with Tim Westergren, who was the founder of Pandora, and it was really kind of interesting. A woman called in. This was when we were going through the rate battles in 2007, and said, "Please don't shut down Pandora. I love it. I've heard all this great music." And then she said something very interesting. She said, I've found all these great new bands. I haven't bought any of their CDs yet, but I will soon, I promise. And that was, a really interesting point to me, which was, I'm hearing such great music on Pandora, I don't need to buy CDs. It's a substitutional service because it entertains you and it provides you with what you need when you're trying to listen to music. Understand that. When I say fair rates, the other side will always yell that it's too much money, that it's too high. We had a really interesting learning experience. 2 years ago, an independent artist sent me a little note saying, I got 400,000 plays on Pandora, and I only got a check from Sound Exchange for $360. Something's wrong. And I said, no, nothing's wrong. 9/100 of a penny, that's the statutory rate, for each play, times 400,000 equals $360. Understand, 800 plays on Pandora equals 1 download on iTunes, and that's if you own all of your rights on the iTunes download. You're the songwriter, you're the record label, you're the publisher, you own everything. So, think about the math. So Spotify's not very different. 800 plays equals 1 download. So it's a very tough bargain, when you're really trying to make sure. If in fact we're moving from a consumption-based world to an access-based world where if you can access things, that's all you care about, then we better make sure we're being paid for access. Because otherwise, you'll have another job in addition to being a musician.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Any first thoughts, any reactions to, we're just about that time where we're going to open the floor up for questions. Well, while we think about that, how would, this room is filled with people going to the music industry, more specifically people who are singers, songwriters, performers. Going forward, what are the, older artists didn't have the luxury of knowing the litigations and the issues they should be concerned about. What would you say young artists and performers should be thinking about going forward in the changing laws in the world of accessibility?
I think that when you're an artist, and for those of you who are artists, the most important thing is your art. The most important thing is what you create and being individual and unique. And I would you should know enough about business, because obviously business is important, and if you don't know anything about business, you'll get taken advantage of. Happens too frequently, unfortunately, in our business. But you do want to build a team of people you trust around you, people who do take care of the business. If you're great at social media, if you're great at making videos, it's very interesting today, the tools that you have that weren't available to people of my generation, certainly, and even 10, 15 years ago. You didn't have YouTube phenomenons. On the other hand, name me one band that's blown up on YouTube, and is now a platinum selling act touring arenas. Justin Bieber. Okay, we got one. Rebecca Black is not selling out arenas.
Let's not put that on the list, please. I don't want. I'm sorry.
And I fear. I'm actually happy. I don't think she ever will. No, just kidding. I didn't say that, actually.
Take that out of the webcast.
Yeah, please remove that. It's rare. Let's put it that way. It's rare, but it's helpful. Use it. One of the things that I'm talking to a lot of young bands, and it's still about getting goosebumps, and that's what it always was for me. When I was listening to a track with a friend and I got goosebumps, like, wow, this is amazing. That's what it's about. And when the hair stands up on the back of your head, or you get whatever it is, when you have that passion for a piece of music, something's there. Now sometimes it's not the most commercial piece of music, and maybe it's not going to sell to a mass audience. I was a major cult fanatic of the Polyphonic Spree. I don't know if any of you guys know that band.
We have some fans. Fans.
Love this band, right? And Sound Exchange actually sponsored one of their South by Southwest shows because I could.
That's why you want to own a performance right group, right there.
To me, it's about loving music and believing in what you love, even when it's not going to be a mass thing. I used to tell bands, that I managed, look, you can be McDonald's. It's nice selling 14 billion. But you could also be a really nice French restaurant down the street. And the people who come to you are going to have a much nicer experience, right? You're not going to make as much money unless you get really fluky lucky and you turn into that person who has a really nice chain, high-end chain, right? But know what you want to be, understand what you want to be, and execute that game plan. There's a lot of blueprints out there, things that you can use. Make sure you use them. You have a lot more tools at your disposal. I think there's this thing called Artist House. You probably haven't heard of it.
Those of you who don't know, that's John Snyder's baby.
No, there's a lot of tools that you have now that we never had. To me, it's do what you love, believe in it, work really hard at it, and then try to network like crazy to find the one person that you need to find, who loves it too, who will be the person who evangelizes for you to get you to the next group of people. When I started with bands, one of the things I realized was, first I had to lead an education campaign within the record company, educating everyone at the label why this band was really great and why they should all care, and why they should go out there and kill people. Because it's really hard. If you're going to radio to play a new artist, it's much easier to get them to play the new Springsteen single. Well, it was then. It's easier to get the Taylor Swift single played today than it is, brand new band no one's heard of. And they're going to go do the easy thing. Why do they do the hard thing? Because they love it. Because you have told them it's important. And I think that's always part. So you're educating first your record company, then you're educating the industry, and finally you get to educate the public about why they should care about this artist. You have a lot more niches where you can educate people. If you can compile email lists or Facebook friends, you can sort of go around the companies. I sit here thinking, do you need major labels when they're going to wait until you have 100,000 hits on your YouTube video? Well, when you have 100,000 hits on your YouTube video, you know, if it's real, and we just talked about the one exception where I don't think it was really real, but if it's real and people love it, and it's not that guy, whatever his name was on American Idol, William Hung. People like car accidents too, and train wrecks. But that doesn't mean they're going to buy them. So I think, you know, use those tools and use them as best you can.
Any questions? Could you go use the microphone? Could we get him a microphone? We got one up here for you, Zach.
Sorry. Keeping in mind that the profit margins on companies such as Pandora aren't incredibly high, don't you think it's wiser to keep the rates lower so as not to drive them out of business? Because as we've seen, when these companies aren't around, for example, in the Napster days, the demand is still there, and illegal companies such as Napster take their places. And as a quick side note to that, it seems to me that it's a fallacy to imply that the rates aren't worth it because there's 800 plays in order to get one iTunes download. But I mean, one iTunes download, how many times is that played? I mean, it's an infinite number of plays. So we're not talking about ownership, we're talking about access. So I'm looking for some clarification there.
Well, think about it. How many times, does anyone here think they've listened to a song in their iPod 800 times? Okay, there you go. So the point though is that is 800 plays on Pandora, you know, is that too low? Is it, you know, should it be lower? My worry is that if the rates are too low, they'll just give away the music for free. You need to force them to monetize. When I visited Pandora last November, you know, they're friends of mine, and we talk about business. They're the first company that's really out there, really trying to sell advertising. And you know, you may say, well, I don't like the fact that I now have to listen to audio ads. But you know, you have a choice. You can buy a subscription and pay for it. I mean, let's think about the value proposition. People who buy satellite radio, and it's 21 million people, pay $10 a month roughly. You know, some people pay a little more, some people pay a little less. $10 a month. That means satellite radio is generating $120 a person a year. We get paid 7.5% of their revenue for the music, 8% next year. And then we go into a new rate proceeding for 2013 to 2017. I can't believe I'm still saying we, because I haven't been there since the end of the year. But $120 is what's generated satellite radio per listener. Over-the-air radio. This is where they don't charge you anything, but you listen to the commercials. As they say, you pay by attention. You're supposed to be, that's the bargain you make. I'll listen to those commercials if you'll give me free radio. 237 million people. They've earned $14 billion last year. You can do the math, but they earn around $70 per person a year, where you don't pay a thing. Pandora, with 90, 100 million listeners, earned $100 million. That's $1 a listener.
Wow.
Okay, so 120, 70, $1. There's a problem if we're going to charge everybody the same rate. So you have to force these companies to monetize. And there's a perfect example. Last FM took music from the music industry to build an audience. They then turned around and sold the company for $290 million. When they sold it for $290 million, did the artists whose music built the company get paid anything? No. They got zero. If they had said to me, give us a really low rate, and then we'll give you 10% when we sell, that's a deal I probably would have taken. But what they did was they used the statute, they used this, what's called the small webcaster statute that we had for little guys who aren't monetizing very much, and they paid us very little to build an audience. It's not about monetizing for a lot of these services. It's about building an audience so they can flip themselves and sell. Let's understand what the motives are here to understand that. If they give us a piece of the sale price, fine. Now remember too, if you control your own music and you want to give it away, you're free to do that. There's nothing preventing you from going out to any of these services and saying, you can have my music for free. We're not trying to stop you from doing that, or SoundExchange isn't stopping you from doing that. The services may not want to have to do all these individual licenses because it's much easier for them to pay once, report once. It's the easy button. But they don't have to. And there are services out there that have gone to the trouble to license every single thing they do and say, we can't afford to pay rates, we're going to stream for free. And as long as they sign deals with those people for free, that's fine. So just understand the economics of this, and we're trying to preserve a future where there's an ecosystem and you can get paid for your work.
We have time for about one more question. Are we going to wrap it up here? We got one. Oh, okay, make this a very short question. Sorry.
Actually, I was going to ask, where do you see the music industry in 5 years, and the distribution of music, and what roles do you see Nisbet and Bandcamp playing in that type of industry?
What role do I see who playing?
Like Bandcamp and Nisbet, sites like that?
I think there's more and more tools for independent artists every day. And typically what happens, and we saw it in webcasting, 20 services pay 95% of Sound Exchange royalties. 20 pretty big companies for the most part, Pandora being one of them, pay 95% of the revenue. There's thousands of others out there, but it's 20. And the same thing's going to happen on Reverb Nation, Sonic Bids, all these different, people trying to provide services to independent artists and to DIY, which I think is just going to keep growing. And I think that's going to shake itself out. There will only be room in the marketplace for Topspin and whoever is going to survive. So I think we're going to see a few of those become sort of the trusted sources. I think filters will continue to be a really big role. People found out when they went to mp3.com in the early days that no one really wants to wade through 5,000 hours of bad music to find one good thing. We used to rely on certain types of people, our favorite DJ, on FM radio when it used to be a free-form format, or college radio where they still have the freedom to play what they want as opposed to homogenized corporate playlists. Those are the kind of things you trust people. Nick Harcourt on public radio at Morning Becomes Eclectic. He's a trusted source of music if you want to know what to listen to. And I think that those kinds of filters, those kinds of trusted sources are going to become increasingly more important as the major labels become less important, as it's harder and harder for them to invest, because the return on investment has changed so dramatically. I see us continuing to move away from purchases into access. I mean, we all know the cloud is coming in some form, and the question is, let's just make sure people get paid from the cloud.
Yeah. The Straight Talk from John Simson. Thank you so much for having me. Turn your